Okay, welcome back to continue Chapter 8, China and the World, East Asian Connections. And now we're going to continue with China and the Northern Nomads, and Chinese world order in the making. And for most of its history, China's most enduring interaction with foreigners was in the north, with the peoples of the steppes. The Northern Nomads typically lived in small kinship-based groups, but occasionally there was a creation of a powerful state or confederation like the Xiongnu Confederation or the Mongols. But these were primarily pastoral societies, and they dealt with the Chinese because they needed various items. They needed grain, other farm products. The leaders wanted the Chinese manufactured goods and their luxury goods. And the Chinese felt a lot of pressure and intrusion from those northern nomads. And this was a constant factor in Chinese history for about 2,000 years. And the nomads actually often felt threatened by the Chinese. There were several Chinese military attacks on the steppes. Even the Great Wall was built to keep the northern nomads out. But in reality, China needed the nomads. The steppes provided horses and other goods, and the nomads controlled much of the Silk Roads. And it was done so in such a way that it allowed for China to make a great amount of money. It boosted their economy because they were the ones that, for a long time, were the ones producing the silk, which was desired by civilizations and societies much further west. So China needed the nomads to safely control much of the Silk Roads for them. So let's look at the tribute system. Now this is covered a little bit in section 1, and we've already talked about it, but we'll continue here. And we're going to look at the tribute system in theory first. Let's really break this down. The Chinese understood themselves as the center of the world, or the Middle Kingdom. And they viewed themselves as the height of civilization, where culture and civilization were just radiating outwards from the middle. And this was the inferior barbarians were expected to recognize this Chinese superiority. And thus we see the establishment of the tribute system. That was to manage the relations that the Chinese had with non-Chinese peoples. Now, non-Chinese authorities were expected to acknowledge Chinese superiority, present tribute to the Chinese emperor, and in return they would receive trading privileges and bestowals in return. But sometimes, as we've already talked about, that was often worth more than the tribute itself. And the system apparently worked for a very long time. These tribute missions and kowtows were presented to the emperor. This is where there were gifts, and this is for prestige. The foreigners were expected to send tribute missions with these ceremonial gifts to the capital, perform a kowtow. That's a series of bows. I'll write that on here for you. It's a series of bows to the ground, and that's to show their recognition of the Chinese superiority. So it wasn't just about providing the tribute, but it was also demonstrating in the way that they behaved. And in return, the missions, like I said, would get various gifts of great value and the prestige of being allied with China. And this was really a way for the Chinese to manage the inferior barbarians on the periphery. But this was the tribute system in practice. The system really disguised some contradictory realities. Some of the nomadic empires could deal with China on at least equal terms, as opposed to being inferior. Like I mentioned earlier, the Xiongnu Confederacy that was established 200 BCE or so, and the Turkic empires of Mongolia, also similar ideas. The nomadic raids into China, in reality, China was vulnerable. They weren't superior, if you will, but they were vulnerable to raids from those warlike horsemen of the steppes, and at times they not only raided but also conquered parts of China. And the steppe nomads, they didn't want to conquer and rule China. They just preferred to extort the Chinese or to use them. But the nomads moved in when the Chinese state broke down, and several steppe states took control of parts of northern China. And the reality of the tribute system for these stronger groups was essentially that the Chinese paid protection to the raiders. So there were large gifts of wine and silk and grain that kept the nomads from having to steal from the Chinese, and that allowed the Chinese court to maintain that fiction of its invulnerability and its superiority. Nonetheless, in times of weakness, China remained vulnerable, and different empires seized parts of northern China, especially after the fall of the Tang dynasty, and would force even the Sung dynasty to give them silver and silk and tea as well. And, I'm sorry, I should have switched slides. I didn't realize that I had needed to. Sorry. I'm just going off in my head and going down. But like I was saying earlier, these are the gifts that the Xiongnu and the Mongols, and they basically were taking payment from the Chinese as protection. This is a great picture. Let's explain the scene in this painting. This painting is an idealized representation of the tribute system in China during the Qing dynasty, and that would be the Qing dynasty. On the right sits the emperor on a stage surrounded by court officials. To the left are three men with a white horse, and behind them in a line are two more men with what looks to be like Central Asian headgear, as well as a black horse and a white and brown horse. The man closest to the white horse is on his knees, bowing to the Chinese emperor on his throne. He's performing the kowtows. So where do you think this scene is set, and why? Well, the scene takes place not in the emperor's palace, but out in the open. There are trees behind the emperor's throne, as you can see, and a pile of rocks in the forefront. It is unlikely that the emperor would have set up court in the wilderness in the outdoors, so the scenery is part of the idealization of the painting. The emperor probably, insisted on tribute payments from nomadic tribes in the north and the west, and so this painting visualizes the fact through the tribute system the emperor's authority extends far into the provinces and even into the wilderness, right, those barbarians. And so even though the emperor was highly unlikely to set up court outside and beyond the walls of his palace, this, like I said, it's to give that idea of his authority and how far it extends. So what does this image suggest about the relationship between nomadic tribes and the Chinese Empire? And would you say this is an accurate portrayal? And you should think about that for a little bit. Because the painting suggests that the nomadic tribes were subservient to the Chinese emperor, right? Performing the kowtows and probably presenting these horses. So it looks like they're supposed to be subservient to the Chinese emperor, and they were dependent on his goodwill and his mercy. But in reality, the tribute system was more reciprocal, or more on equal terms. The Xiongnu Federation of Nomadic Tribes, they were able to command gifts from the Chinese emperor in exchange for the promise not to raid the northern provinces. So this probably isn't an accurate portrayal of the tribute system, but it's very interesting when you break it down and look at the different pieces. Okay, cultural influence across an ecological frontier. Now, the nomads who ruled parts of China often adopted Chinese ways, but Chinese culture did not have a great impact on the steppe nomads. The pastoral societies really retained their own cultural patterns. Most lived where Chinese-style agriculture was impossible. That should say not possible. This should be impossible. There we go. Sorry about that. Saw that and was a little confused. Chinese agriculture and lifestyle just wasn't possible on the steppes. I mean, there were some aspects of the Chinese culture that made their way north, but the agriculture and material life was just impossible on the steppes and the grasslands of Central Asia. So there was little way to replicate being Chinese amongst those nomads. But interaction took the form of trade, military conflict, negotiations, extortion, and some cultural influence. And the steppe culture definitely influenced the parts of northern China that were ruled frequently by the nomads. The founders of the Sui and Tang dynasties were of mixed blood, actually. And the Tang dynasty, there was a fad among the northern Chinese elites that was for anything connected to those Western barbarians. As both the Tang and Sung dynasties had their origin, like I was saying, mixed with the Sino-Turkic families, there was a great influence, really particularly on court culture and the elite and the bureaucrats. Our battle techniques were also used by Chinese generals in the battlefield. So the northern nomads had a much larger impact on the Chinese than the Chinese did on the nomads. And that culture of the Western barbarians was almost considered fashionable, especially during the Tang dynasty. There was this fad, like I said, for things from the West, like Central Asia and Persia, India, Arabia. Music, fashion, dancing, and other aspects of culture were popular amongst those elites. But there was some backlash in the South. The southern Chinese, they saw themselves as the heirs to the Han. And remember, with the collapse of the Han Empire and that period of what's the word I'm looking for? Just chaos and the warring states, nothing, no centralized power. Remember when when the Sui came in and reunified China, that's what was in Section 1, right? It was about reestablishing, control and the centralized authority from the Han. And so the southern Chinese saw themselves as heirs to the Han or from the Han. And so they're extremely critical of the fad for anything foreign. And that concludes Section 2.